Falling off is defined as the act of getting smaller than or becoming less. In our current internet culture, this happens a whole lot. One day you're on top of the world, and the next you're forgotten and go back to living like all the rest of us commoners. Though the phrase is typically associated with individuals, history has shown us that the biggest fall-offs are countries who at one time or another ruled the entire world before losing it all and is now struggling to just exist. So in today's video, I have devised a list of the top 10 countries that have fallen off. But before we begin, I feel that it is necessary to lay some ground rules. Everyone's opinion of falling off is different, and if I offend anyone because of my views or mispronunciations like what happened during the last top 10 video, I just want you to think, he, stupid American, he have small brain, big credit card debt. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, why don't we get right into today's video. Number 1, Argentina. Though it's hard to see today, Argentina was once viewed as a country that had the capabilities to rival the United States and be the dominant country in the Western Hemisphere. But as you're going to find out, that is definitely not what happened. The history of Argentina really begins when the Spanish arrived in 1516. Unlike a lot of Spain's colonial holdings, Argentina did not have a large quantity of precious metals, so the settlers had to focus more on agriculture and trade, which helped them out tremendously in the long run. As the years went by and the Spanish Empire began to crumble, Argentina started to slowly become more and more independent, to the point where in the years 1606 and 07, they were able to withhold 2 British invasions without any help from the Spanish mainland. So in 1816, the Argentinians declared independence, though they were not officially recognized by Spain until 1863. With their colonial overlords gone, the new nation had some problems deciding how their government should work, with the main conflict being between the Unitarians, who wanted a strong central government, and the Federalists, who wanted the provinces to have more power. A series of civil wars were fought, and the ultimate outcome was the Unitarians coming out on top, which would come to define Argentinian life to this day. Starting in the 1860s, this new, somewhat stable society began to experience massive economic growth, with new advancements in agriculture, railroads, ports, and a wave of European immigration. And by 1913, it was receiving the most foreign investment out of any other country in South America. At its peak, which was in the years prior to World War I, Argentina had one of the highest GDPs in the entire world. It is really easy to see why so many believed that this South American country could one day rival the United States. That, however, was not meant to be. And after the early 1910s, Argentina started to decline. With the start of World War I, the foreign investment that the economy depended on dried up. And even though they were doing well by declaring neutrality and continued to trade with both England and Germany, it was not enough to rival their past success. Then the Great Depression happened, which killed all the prosperity that the Argentinians had worked so hard to achieve. The economy was decimated by the Depression, and things were made even worse when on September 6, 1930, a military coup took place, where General Jose Felix took over, setting up the country for years of instability. Argentina then became a land of coups, corruption, and conflict until 1983, when the people finally had enough, and in a fair election, constitutional rule came back into the country. Things, however, did not get better for the poor Argentinian people. The government began instituting neoliberal economics into the country, which had severe consequences. Today, the country is racked with debt, and inflation is 80%, which is a significant improvement. But I believe there is hope. In 2023, this guy became president. I wish them all the best, but I now think it's time to move on to our next country. Number 2, Mali. Founded in 1226, the Mali Empire is the largest West African state in history. The man who started it all was Sundiata Keita, who was able to reunite the 12 kingdoms. Eventually, rule fell to his grandnephew Mansa Musa, who would rule during what is widely regarded as the Mali Empire's golden age. The government made a killing by taxing the gold and salt that was traded in its territory, which gave the people immense prosperity. Because of this, the government devoted many resources to the construction of universities, mosques, and a strong army that none in the region could rival. Perhaps the most famous example of the ample wealth this civilization had was when Mansa Musa went on his 2-year pilgrimage to Mecca. The journey was over 4,000 miles long and consisted of an entourage of 60,000 and 80 to 100 gold-packing camels. To show how stupid rich this guy was, when he stopped by Cairo, he spent so much gold that it decimated the local economy for years due to all the inflation that it brought. Mansa Musa was a good leader. But after his death in 1337, the empire he ruled so well slowly began to crumble. Starting in the late 1300s, a series of weak rulers allowed for the once mighty and prosperous empire to become a shell of its former self. Mansa Muhammad IV was the last Mali emperor, and when he died, no one came forward to take his spot. After this, all that remained of the once glorious people were some constantly warring states. All of this instability gave the French, who were trying to expand their colonial empire, the perfect opportunity to invade, which is exactly what they did in 1892. During the next 68 years, Mali was a part of French Sudan, but that changed in 1960 when they declared independence, officially becoming their own country again. Since that time, I would not exactly say that things have changed for the better. The country has experienced immense instability, with military coups and territorial warlords becoming the norm throughout its relatively short history. The country that at one time was the wealthiest in all of Africa now has an extreme poverty rate of 44%, a sad end to the once glorious empire. Number 3. Cuba. Cuba became a Spanish colony in 1492, and since then it has had a long history marked by violence and instability. Being only 90 miles away from their mainland, the American government did not feel too comfy with the idea of an imperial superpower within their so-called sphere of influence, so they decided to free the Cuban people from their overlords during the Spanish-American War, which lasted from April to December of 1898. When the Spanish were defeated and the Americans were heavily compensated with a boatload of territory, Cuba could now be allowed to become a land of peace and prosperity where God and freedom reigned. Cuba! 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 Unfortunately, that is not exactly what happened. You see, America could not technically conquer Cuba because of the Teller Amendment, which stated that America would help out the Cuban people in their quest for independence while making sure they remained a sovereign state. So to combat this restriction, America had to come up with some ingenious ways to exert their influence on the new nation. You see, there were no Cuban representatives during the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, so the U.S. could really just draft up whatever they wanted. So the heroes of the U.S. government made it so that Cuba would allow them to have land for naval and army purposes, intervene for the preservation of the state, and make sure Cuba would take on no foreign debt, so that no big country tries to stop the freedom of the poor Cuban people. So after occupying the island until 1902 and making sure a government they liked was in charge, the American military left, but the businessmen did not. By 1905, 10% of Cuban land was owned by American businesses, along with 80% of ore production and most of the cigar factories. By being a banana republic, Cuba was able to do pretty good for itself, though instability in good old America was always present. But as time went on, the Cuban government started to go more and more off the deep end. There was a lot of the usual corrupt government practices, like the exploitation of civilians, media censorship, torture. But hey, I think it might be worth it to have one of the highest GDPs in Latin America. But learning what we have about the Cuban people, I think you can probably guess that they were not okay with this kind of treatment. So one day, a lawyer by the name of Fidel Castro decided to write a petition to the courts in an effort to depose the current government. He was ignored. This set him off, and the revolution began. In 1953, he attempted to overthrow the government by attacking the Moncada barracks. The assault was a failure, and Castro was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but only served 2 before being released to Mexico. He returned in December of 1956 and picked up right where he left off. This time, luck was on his side, and on February 15th, 1959, he became Prime Minister of Cuba, a true rags-to-riches story. Initially, Americans were really excited about him coming into office, but when he began to seize American-owned businesses and became more and more friendly with the Soviet Union, these feelings worsened. After only 6 months of being in power, the Eisenhower administration was already working to overthrow him, and the U.S. had officially severed all relations and enforced a trade ban. The Soviet Union saw this as the perfect opportunity to mess with America, so they began really upping the relationship with Cuba, and soon the entire Cuban economy was being upheld by Soviet subsidiaries. 4 months into the Kennedy administration, America attempted to overthrow the Castro regime at the Bay of Pigs with a group of CIA-trained refugees. The result was an absolute failure, and it almost sent the entire world into a nuclear war. After the whole Bay of Pigs fiasco, Cuba reached an agreement with the Soviet Union in which they would receive nuclear missiles in order to deter a U.S. invasion. America did not like this, and the tension that ensued almost resulted in World War III. Eventually, a settlement was agreed upon, where the Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. would pinky promise not to invade, and also remove their Jupiter missiles from Turkey. It was really after this that the decline of Cuba started. Castro began to go off the rails with concentration camps, secret police, and a whole lot of other equally crazy and heinous stuff. But things were still kind of going okay because of the billions of dollars that they received annually from the Soviets. They even got into a whole phase where they would fight in third world conflicts in an effort to spread liberty to the world. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991, Cuba lost its lone benefactor, and let me tell you, things got bad. Poverty, widespread food insecurity, and blackouts decimated the Cuban people. Though things were worse in the 90s, the situation has not gotten much better. Cuba remains socialist and still has a dictatorship, and the Cuban people are still suffering. For all the other countries I have on this list, I say that they have fallen off because they lost all the power they once had. Though this is true for Cuba, the main reason I believe that it's fallen off is because it isn't relevant anymore. Sure, it had a good run in the 60s when it could have blown up the Western world, but since then, there's been nothing of interest to talk about. Number 4, the Netherlands. In America, we don't know that much about the Netherlands, so I was surprised to learn that at one point in history, this country that I thought little of was one of the richest in the entire world. You see, the people of the Netherlands have always been a pretty smart bunch. Starting in the 1300s, they began to reclaim land from the sea on a massive scale. This would lead them into what is now known as the Dutch Golden Age, which is officially called the Dutch Republican period, and let me tell you, it was peak. You see, after the Dutch had spent years constantly fighting off their foreign overlords, the Spanish, they really began to unlock their full potential. The way that they achieved this was through their shipping empire. With the help of the first full-time stock exchange, Dutch companies were able to have trading posts all over the world, and by 1650, they owned over 20,000 ships. How could a country so small achieve this, you might be asking? Well, it's for a variety of reasons. The first is the religious tolerance that the Dutch inherited. After years of getting religion shoved down their throats, they had enough and decided that as long as they were making money, it did not matter what you did. This allowed them to be able to trade with almost the entire world, unlike most of Europe at this time, who believed that unless you followed their denomination of Christianity, you deserved to die. The Dutch's high level of religious tolerance is why in 1639 they were able to be the only Western country who had trading rights in Japan, because all the other whiteys kept on trying to forcibly convert the Japanese people to Christianity. One of the other reasons the Dutch were able to thrive during this period is how they made their money. I'm sure we've all seen the financial videos where they bring up how in the California gold rush, the guys that really made bank were the ones who sold the shovels to the miners and didn't look for gold themselves. If you're like me, you watched that, thought, that seems super boring, and then moved on to something unproductive. But the Dutch, they actually took that to heart. Their empire, unlike most of the time, was focused entirely on the shipping of goods and not the production of them. And when you combine that with a killer agricultural program, it is easy to see why the Dutch were on top of the world when it came to politics, culture, and economics. For a time, it looked like the Dutch were here to stay, but unfortunately that did not happen. Due to its small size, the Dutch had trouble fighting their more powerful neighbors. This caused them to spend massive amounts of money to try and stay afloat, which they were able to do, but resulted in them no longer being able to focus on innovation, and were left behind by the rest of the world. The Dutch Republic was able to stay afloat until World War II, when it was invaded by Nazi forces and got a little too chummy with their occupiers. After all the devastation that the war caused, there was nothing that could be done to maintain the remnants of a once mighty colonial empire. And by 1975, there was nothing left. Today, the Netherlands still remain a somewhat powerful country on the European stage, but is only a shadow of its former self. Number 5. Portugal. It was not until I took a class on European history last year that I found out Portugal was actually at one point in history relevant. Up until then, I had just assumed it was a less cool Spain, but let me tell you, I could not have been more wrong. Though having been a country since 1143, it was not until 1415, with the acquisition of Ceuta, that the Portuguese Empire began. The Portuguese were in a very special position because they were almost completely isolated from the rest of Europe, while also having a strong ally to the west of them for protection. This allowed them to focus more on trade and innovation, without having to be dragged into any costly conflicts. Over time, the Portuguese began to expand more and more into Africa, and were the first Europeans to round the Cape, which allowed them to have access into Asian markets. Soon, Portuguese ships were bringing in gold, ivory, pepper, cotton, sugar, slaves. Really, if you can name it, they were selling it. The Portuguese were the leaders of the Age of Discovery, and they soon had territories in the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Oceania. This allowed them to experience a crazy level of prosperity, and during the 1500s, they were at the peak of culture, politics, and economic matters. But as they say, what goes up must come down. In 1578, King Sebastio I of Portugal died while fighting in Morocco without leaving a direct heir to the throne. Well, good old Philip II of Spain saw all the commotion and thought, that looks easy. So he took it over and united the two world empires under Habsburg rule in 1580, while allowing them to each stay a distinct state. One would think that the combination of these two great powers would be mutually beneficial, and they could combine their efforts to form an empire the likes of which have never been seen before. But let me tell you, that is not what happened. By staying out of foreign politics, the Portuguese were able to expand their empire far wider than what they could have done if they were at constant war with some nation or another. But now, thanks to the Iberian Union, Spain's problems were Portugal's problems. This resulted in a significant loss of territory and influence, as they did not have the manpower to control the rapidly escalating problem. Perhaps the worst defeat was when they lost most of India to the British, which was crucial to their empire. Eventually, they caught on and realized that the union with Spain was the cause of all their problems. So the Portuguese Restoration War was started in 1640 and ended 28 years later in 1668, which helped the wounded empire recover into a more gradual decline. Things got pretty heated in 1802 when a perfectly average-heighted man for the time invaded the mainland, setting up his own puppet state and causing the real government to move to Brazil until the constitutional monarchy was restored in 1820. It was in 1822, however, when Brazil declared independence, an act that caused a lot of problems for the already dying empire. Soon, Portugal lost all of southern Africa and all but a few places in Asia. But they did make bank during the European scramble for Africa. In the years that followed the Napoleonic Wars, Portugal was basically a British puppet state, and that, combined with a worsening economic situation, caused the 1910 revolution, in which the monarchy was overthrown and a republic was made. During both world wars, Portugal remained somewhat neutral, as they have been throughout history, but even that was not enough to maintain its empire. After World War II, Portugal fought in an effort to try and maintain their colonial holdings, but it was not enough, and one by one their colonies fell, with the last one being Macau in 1999. The Cold War tore the nation apart, and today it is no longer dominant in European affairs. Even though their dominance ended, you have to give the Portuguese credit where credit is due. They were able to have an empire with a territorial peak of 5.1 million square kilometers, one of the largest in history, and Portuguese remains the 6th most spoken language in the world. So I believe that it was better that they peaked and lost it all than never peaking at all. Number 6. Turkey. Turkey has a long history when it comes to being part of world powers. It has been occupied by the Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines. But it was only with the founding of the Ottoman Empire did it truly become a land to be reckoned with. After emerging from northwestern Anatolia in 1299, the Ottomans quickly made themselves a transcontinental empire. Their rise to power came to be through a variety of reasons, the most important of which is that the plague-ridden European powers in the region could do nothing to stop the strong Ottoman army. During the 15th and 16th century, it seemed like the Ottomans could not be touched. They were even slowly pushing themselves into the European continent, ending the last remnants of the Roman Empire with the taking of Constantinople in 1453. One of the ways that they were able to achieve so much success was due to their almost complete control of trade into Europe from Asia, and let me tell you, they took advantage of that. At its territorial peak in the late 1500s, the Ottoman Empire covered nearly 7 million square miles and had an army and navy to die for. This level of prosperity allowed for the time and resources to be spent for the betterment of mankind, with significant contributions to the fields of math, astrology, and medicine. For a while, it seemed that the Ottomans could not stop, but then they did. Over time, the empire became more and more dysfunctional. Its government started to be more decentralized, and the army was not keeping up with the new technological innovations that changed the entire game of warfare. And perhaps worst of all, the trade routes that enabled the Ottoman people to live a life of luxury became worthless, because those pesky Europeans seemed to be discovering a new trade route every day. This downward spiral began with the failed siege of Vienna in 1683, and it did not stop from there. Though it was somewhat stable during the 1700s, it had to declare bankruptcy in 1876 due to fighting the Crimean War because Russia was starting to get a little too handsy with their territory. Europe was more than happy to help the Ottomans out in their economic woes, but by doing so, they were able to take control of the Ottoman economy, essentially monopolizing it in their favor. This caused the empire's economy to become heavily reliant on foreign countries and not produce its own stuff, which made the economic situation even worse. In an effort to try and revitalize the ruins of a once great civilization, a group of young intellectuals called the Young Turks overthrew the government on July 3rd, 1908, making the empire a constitutional monarchy. When World War I came around, the Ottoman Empire sided with the Axis powers in an effort to try and gain back all the land that the Europeans had taken from them. But this decision turned out to be a total failure. Though achieving initial success with victories at Gallipoli and Kut, they could not sustain a multi-front war at a time when they were just barely struggling to get by. Eventually, as we all know, the Axis lost, which left the Ottoman Empire in a really awkward situation on the world stage. Europe really wanted all their stuff, so after everything was said and done, the once mighty empire was humiliated. This was too much to bear for the Turkish nationalists, who started the Turkish War of Independence, which lasted from 1919 to 1923, and ended with the Sultanate officially being abolished, and a grand national assembly taking charge of the country and ending the 600-year-old empire. Since then, the country has faced a number of military coups, with the latest successful one being in 1997. There's ongoing economic instability, civil rights are being denied, and domestic abuse is prevalent. You know, the typical problems for a country that peaked 400 years ago. But hey, at least their president isn't a ruthless dictator who denies free speech and equality. Well, on second thought. Number 7, Greece. Everyone knows about Greece. The rich history, the scenic views, the birthplace of Western civilization. But the more you look at it, the more obvious it becomes that the Greeks fell off hard. At its core, Greece throughout most of its ancient history was a collective of competing city-states. This was due to the mountainous terrain of the mainland, which made separation between territories incredibly easy. Because of this, Greece was kind of able to do its own thing and not be bothered by anyone else, which caused them to come up with some truly crazy ideas. For example, Athens decided to invent this thing called democracy, which meant as long as you were an adult male citizen, you could have a say in the government. Or they had these guys who would just sit around and think about why humans did things. Yeah, that was their entire purpose. They also heavily focused on technological innovation, which allowed them to have colonies as far as Ukraine, and foster perhaps the most advanced pre-industrialized economy. Yeah, the Greeks were just built different, but the division that allowed them to prosper also made it easier for foreign forces to invade, and this is exactly what the Macedonians did in the years 359 to 323 BC. Though tragic, the consolidation of the city-states helped lead the Greeks to their full potential under the guidance of one of history's great men. I'm of course talking about Alexander the Great. He was called the Great for a reason. In the span of 10 years, he was able to conquer 2 million square miles, defeating the Persian Empire along the way, which many believe was the strongest nation in the world at the time. He also conquered Egypt, Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and even got as far as India before his men had enough and made him go back, despite his pleading. While doing all this, Alexander revolutionized the art of war, founded over 20 cities, and never lost a battle, and caused the Greeks to expand more in 10 years than most civilizations could dream of. For a while, it seemed like Alexander was the god that he made himself out to be, but death comes to us all. While planning a massive campaign into Arabia while staying at Babylon, Alexander suddenly fell ill and died. Why he died is a matter of debate, but that really doesn't matter. What does matter is that when asked on his deathbed who would inherit his vast empire, he said, "To the best," and then went on to die. Apparently, all of his generals thought they were the most qualified, so Alexander's empire soon became a series of smaller states that were at constant war with each other. At around the same time Greece was having its identity crisis, the Roman Republic was embarking on a mission to rapidly expand its empire. Carthage, being the dominant force in the Mediterranean, was obviously the first to go, but once they were out of the way, Rome's eyes began to linger east. The Greeks did not stand a chance, and soon Greece was a Roman province. Though they had been conquered, the Greek people still contributed a lot to society. It was a valuable Roman asset, and its culture and academic achievements were largely incorporated into Roman society. And it continued to contribute to the Byzantine Empire until it was finally conquered by the Ottomans in 1460. The Greeks did not have the best relationship with their latest overlords. They faced constant discrimination and other problems until they finally had enough, and an open rebellion began in 1821, which the Western world loved. They viewed the conflict as a romantic struggle between the white Christians fighting against their evil Muslim dictators, so they supported the revolution with all they had. With the backing of Britain, France, and Russia, Greece was finally able to get its independence in 1832. After trying to be absolute for a time, a constitutional monarchy was established in 1844, and it looked like it was nothing but up for the revitalized country. Over time, Greece was able to begin modernizing, doubled its entire territory, and had a population boom. Though they had success during the First World War, it was during World War II when it really hit the fan. In 1941, German and Italian forces invaded the mainland, which quickly became too much for the vastly outnumbered Allied troops, and resulted in a Nazi occupation until 1944. The war also resulted in the death of 8% of the total population, and a civil war began as the Americans and Soviets tried to exert their power on the region. Eventually, the capitalists won, and Greece experienced an economic miracle, with a growth rate only second to Japan. It was in the 70s, however, that things began to take a turn for the worse. The economic bubble collapsed, crushed by foreign debt, inflation, and a military coup in Cyprus. All of this resulted in the government falling apart and a republic replacing the monarchy. Today, the country is okay, I guess, but is nothing compared to its former glory. Number 8. Mongolia. Today, Mongolia is a nobody on the world stage. but once it was the center of the largest continuous empire in history. Really, the more I learn about the Mongols, the more ashamed I am to be a part of the human race. But if I have to suffer from learning about them, so do you. So let's get right into it. Mongolia consists of cold, dry grasslands, which is protected on nearly all sides, with the Adelaide Mountains to the west, the Gobi Desert to the south, and the Siberian wastelands to the north. And throughout most of history, it has been populated by tribes of tough herdsmen who all share a similar language, religion, and way of life. Though they have always posed a risk to those around them, it was not until 1206, when Genghis Khan united the tribes, that they began to dominate the known world. The way they accomplished this was through sheer military dominance. By using fast-paced cavalry warfare, they were able to outmaneuver their enemies, who sometimes outnumbered them 12-1. They also used human shields made up of captured civilians, biological warfare, terror tactics, the complete annihilation of cities, and killed 40 to 60 million people. But really, who are we to judge? Though the ways the Mongols accomplished this is questionable, they were able to expand more in 25 years than the Romans could in 400, a truly impressive feat. Khan's empire covered most of Asia, Eastern Europe, Persia, and the Middle East. And some of the things Khan did wasn't all that bad. For example, he encouraged religious freedom, made one of the first postal systems, promoted civil rights, and also helped spread knowledge from the east to the west, greatly helping out humanity. When Khan died in 1227, his empire was divided amongst his heirs, but the Mongols as a whole were more powerful than ever. It was during this fracture that a relative peace was established, which made the land prosper. Over time, however, this division became detrimental, as constant infighting greatly reduced their strength, and the armies that the Mongols had once destroyed adapted to the times, and slowly things began to fall apart. By the 15th century, the Mongols were back in their historic heartland, and was under direct control by the Qing dynasty. In 1911, Russia convinced Mongolia to declare independence, in an effort to make a buffer state, though it was not until 1921 that they gained recognition. Well, it was really just a Soviet puppet state. So that ended in 1991, and then Mongolia became the country that we know it as today. Unfortunately, 30% of the country lives in poverty, and Mongolia is no longer dominant in Asian affairs. For a country that once struck fear into the hearts of anyone it came across, I believe that the Mongolians have officially fallen off. Number 9. Italy. Recently, for no apparent reason, I have gotten really into the Roman Empire. I guess all men are genetically programmed to have an obsession with the Romans, and when you look at their history, it's easy to see why. When it first started, Rome was a monarchy, and it stayed that way for the first 250 years of its history, until the people finally had enough and a republic was made, where rich male citizens from powerful families could rule over the lesser folk. Though their idea of democracy was a little different from our standards, the Roman Republic was still awesome. The government was headed by 2 consuls, whose terms only lasted 1 year. This caused them to try and get all the glory they could before their time ran out, which is why, during the Roman Republic, the empire began to grow at a crazy rate. By the end of the 3rd century BC, the Romans had unified the Italian peninsula and began to focus on the Mediterranean, which they were able to conquer by the 1st century BC. It was beautiful. The Republic, however, might have been too good to last, and after a period of political unrest and civil wars, it became a militarized dictatorship under the disguise of a constitutional monarchy, and stayed that way until the end. But before I go any further, I just need to go on a Rome rant. I don't believe it's possible for me to express just how awesome I think the Romans were, but I am sure going to try. It was called the Empire Without an End, and Roman citizens called the Mediterranean RC. Its army, which had hundreds of thousands of troops, was the most advanced military in the world for well over 300 years. Romans contributed to every single type of academic field imaginable. For God's sake, Renaissance architects had to go to Roman buildings and had to relearn all the techniques because that's just how advanced their building styles were. They were the first to use steam power, made beautiful art. Their city planning was on point, and have you seen their aqueducts? They were able to get fresh water from over 50 miles away. Their three largest cities, Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome, were the largest in the history of the world up until the 1600s. They also helped spread Christianity, which changed the history of humankind forever. And it is believed that at its peak, a quarter of the world's population lived under its rule. Rome is responsible for the development of the entire Western civilization, and for that, I say thank you. But then, one of the greatest tragedies in human history took place. Rome began to fall off. Though the empire reached its greatest heights during the first 200 years of imperial rule, things soon began to get a little bit hectic. The focus was not on the health and expansion of the empire itself, but more on that of the emperors, who wanted to stay in power. This decline began with the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, and there was no stopping it from there. Emperors were constantly being assassinated. The army became more loyal to their generals than the government. Inflation decimated the once mighty economy. The Roman identity that once unified the vast empire died, causing separation between the provinces. And the tribes and kingdoms that Rome had been putting down for centuries were stronger than ever and more than happy to invade Roman lands. In an effort to try and increase stability, Emperor Theodosius broke the empire in half, resulting in the creation of the Western and Eastern empires. Though the Eastern Empire, which is based in Constantinople, would go on to last another 1,000 years in relative prosperity, the same could not be said for their Western brothers. In the matter of 81 years, the empire had fallen to the barbarians and entered into a period of decline. By the Middle Ages, Italy was a collection of warring city-states, but that was not enough for the Italian people. They soon began to make obscene amounts of money because of the spice trade, and it was through this that the Italian Renaissance was born. During this time, there was a rebirth and expansion of the ancient ideas, and it is because of this that the entire course of human history was changed forever. Things were going really well for the Italians. Sure, they were nowhere near their previous heights, but they were still doing amazing. This unfortunately ended when France decided to invade in 1494, which began the process of turning Italy into a fight club for the stronger European powers. After a few hundred years of this, the Italians got tired, and in 1861, the Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed, and it looked for a while like the Italians were going to be back on top. Things, however, took a turn in the 1870s, when the industrial field collapsed, and then, after World War I, everything was gone. Though the war allowed Italy to become completely unified, it sent the country into massive debt and civil unrest. This allowed a bald, angry fascist to overthrow the monarchy and establish a totalitarian state. This bald guy decided it would be really cool to team up with some equally crazy guys in World War II in an effort to restore the Roman Empire. But he ended up losing horribly and was shot, then hung upside down by communist partisans. Yeah, it's safe to assume that the Italian people did not necessarily thrive after World War II. Though there was an economic revival due to the Marshall Plan, things took a turn for the worse, and Italy has never truly recovered. Number 10. The United Kingdom. I think you know why this is on top of the list. The UK is made up of England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And up until the past 100 years, it was the greatest country that the world had ever seen. But in order to understand the rise and fall of the United Kingdom, we first have to scale things back a bit. One of the factors that played into England's success is that it's located on an island, making it easier to be separated from the rest of Europe. This separation allowed for some truly unique ideas to be made, such as the Magna Carta, which was signed in 1215 and stated that the king and his government was not above the law, a truly revolutionary idea at the time. Really what allowed the UK to start its rise as a world power was the ending of the War of the Roses, which lasted from 1455 to 1487 and resulted in the House of Lancaster and York marrying into each other, consolidating the power of the monarchy and in turn stabilizing the country. So after a while of experiencing all the peace that the War of the Roses caused, England got jealous that Spain and Portugal were making a killing by having all those overseas colonies, so they began to replicate it. They started with colonies in North America, but soon had them in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. One of the key factors that allowed them to do this was their amazing navy, which was made in order so the Brits could feel better than the French. For most countries, the good times sort of ended there, but for England, it was just getting started. In 1707, the Kingdom of Great Britain was formed when England and Scotland united while still staying separate. I know, it's complicated. Even though those pesky American colonists broke off in 1776, the empire continued to grow at an exponential rate. And because of all the problems the French faced with their revolution, Britain became the strongest country in the world and was made even stronger by becoming the first industrialized country. And things continued to work out even better with the formation of the United Kingdom in 1801, an act that set the countries up for even more dominance. It also didn't hurt that the rest of Europe was being devastated by the Napoleonic Wars, while they were staying snug 21 miles off the shore. Really, all major innovations that changed how we live in modern times are thanks to the Brits, which is just crazy. Though during the 1800s the UK ruled all around the world, it was not enough for them, which is why they were one of the major countries that pushed for the Berlin Conference, and as a result, got a significant portion of Africa. By 1900, the British Empire was arguably the strongest it had ever been. It had territory on every continent, was the financial center of the world, and its navy was stronger than the two other runner-ups combined. Then World War I came around, and it did not go the best for them. Close to 900,000 British soldiers died in the war to end all wars, and the economy and infrastructure never truly recovered. But that did not stop the British from taking all they could from the defeated Germans and Ottomans. It was after World War I that the United Kingdom reached its territorial height. In all, it covered more than 13.7 million square miles, or a quarter of the entire Earth, and ruled about the same percent of its population. Yes, it was beautiful. The sun never set on the British Empire. You really should have seen it. But around this time, the cracks began to show that the British had bitten off more than they could chew, and the decline soon began. The empire was not strong enough to repress the growing nationalism that was consuming post-World War I, and territories soon began to leave. Also, the United States and Japan soon overpowered British industry, one of its major factors in their survival. Though the situation was not ideal, they were still holding on, and it would only take an economic disaster to have detrimental long-term effects on their civilization's longevity. Well, this stinks, but as long as the most costly war in human history doesn't happen and leads to devastation on the home front as well as abroad, to the point where we can barely keep our island afloat, things should be fine. Oh, that's some really bad luck. If the British were able to somewhat thrive at the end of World War I, that is not what happened after the Second World War. It took everything in the UK's power not to be overtaken by the Nazis, and in the end, the greatest empire that the world had ever seen was left in ruins. The colonies, seeing this, knew it was the perfect time to act, and left one by one. And soon, the empire was only a fraction of its former glory. And it was in 1997, with the departure of Hong Kong, that the once mighty British Empire finally fell. Though the UK has improved significantly from its sorry post-World War state, it is today only a small European country with limited national influence. I think we can learn a whole lot about these former world powerhouses. The most important lesson, at least to me, is that we should know how fragile we truly are, and that the progress that we have spent generations cultivating can vanish without a trace into the pages of history.